Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Monday and welcome back to Norse Studies. This is week 11. So we're going back into the Heathen Handbook by Woden's Folk Kindred and we're looking at section 7. This focuses on symbols and runes. Once a person understands their meaning, it creates kind of a shorthand way of conveying very deep and complex ideas in a simple way, which is always the goal. The authors acknowledge that they will be handling the subject in a very concise way rather than taking an absolutely exhaustive approach. According to them, it would require a myriad of books to fully do justice to the subject. And I concur. It would just be too much information to absorb as an introduction, which would likely result in the person feeling completely overwhelmed and maybe washing their hands of the whole subject. And obviously, that would be counterproductive. And I think that's the broader lesson here, that sometimes the most important thing is to tell someone what the big picture is and then the broad strokes within the picture, and then get to the details further on down the line. But you've got to start with small chunks that people can deal with. So part 1 of this section, symbol fundamentals. The authors provided the dictionary definition for symbol, which is 1, something to be used or is regarded as standing for or representing something else. 2, a material object representing something immaterial. Or 3, an emblem, token, or sign. Symbols are therefore metaphors, concrete objects that represent abstractions. And this is why we see symbols used in flags and ancient heraldry and even in commercial branding. Those are still symbols. Symbols can also represent archetypes. The authors gave the example of a cat. Whenever we see a cat or we see a representation of a cat, we understand the essence of what that animal represents, what catness is. And symbols can also be quite mundane. Our alphabets, numbers, even our road signs are all symbols despite being very everyday things that are just in common use. So then they go to part 2 and they focus on heathen symbols. And they talk about how these are the most common symbols that can be associated with our ancestors that we essentially know about for sure. And they divided them into groups, natural objects, man-made objects, and animals. Within the category of natural objects, the authors broke it down into 3 groups: earth objects, water objects, sky objects. Common earth symbols would include trees, most particularly the world tree, which is a suitable representation of both a single individual and of the entire universe itself, as was covered in previous chapters. Soil, in and of itself, that could be related to a specific geographical area or to the whole planet, or it could even represent the link between oneself and one's ancestors. Then they said that water was a common symbol for things like blood and nourishment, the flow of time, and even of traveling. The sea is a symbol unto itself. It brought our ancestors both food and material wealth, but it was also a natural, powerful force that warranted respect. It could be a life giver or a life destroyer, and that could change at a moment's notice. Then we have the sky. Certainly the sun would be of paramount importance. Without it, life would cease to exist. And next there would be the moon in significance, which would keep both the time and direct the tides. Then they moved on to man-made objects. The first that was mentioned are weapons. It represents those who carry out the business of war and physical conflict, but it also represents things like courage, success, and freedom. Next, the authors discussed objects associated with travel. Think wagons, wheels, ships. To have mobility, whether you are at peace or war, was power. Wheels can also represent the cycle of time. Wheels were used for spinning, and they were often used in conjunction with the spindle and the distaff, which associated wheels specifically with women, the making of cloth and the mastery of household skills, because that was a very fundamental thing that every woman had to not just have knowledge of, but mastery of, because the well-being of the household depended upon it. Finally, we come to the ring, which represents wealth, status, power, and authority. And this holds true whether it was a finger ring, an arm ring, or a neck ring. Rings are also associated with the giving and the receiving of oaths. It makes the evolution of exchanging wedding rings a rather natural progression of that initial custom. Now for animal symbolism. Animals play a variety of roles in the mythos. They can help or they hinder, guide or misdirect. They are omens and messengers. The gods themselves were said to transform into the shape of animals from time to time. So they listed a few, beginning with the wolf, which was all wildness and danger. Interesting, they made mention that the Old Norse word vargur referred to both wolves and outlaws. Then, of course, you can't discuss Norse animal symbols without talking about ravens, and they have complicated associations. On the one hand, they are scavenger birds; they will feast on the dead, but they are also messengers, and some can be trained to speak or at least mimic a human speech, and which really that is a testament to their intelligence, and that intelligence thereby associates them with magic. Next, we have eagles, hawks, and falcons. So think warriors, natural freedom, nobility, not so much as a status, but as a personal attribute, and as well as being a fierce hunter. Then we have snakes. The authors did not think much of snakes, and well, they're not my favorite thing either. But as far as symbolism, it is a mixed guides. They can be guides to various realms. They can be the renewers of life, but they also represent death itself, states of decay, or even moral degeneracy. The context really matters if you're talking about snake symbolism. Then we have cattle, the obvious meaning of fertility, being the product of the union of masculine and feminine energies. They represent abundance. Now, bulls in particular symbolize power and the forces that cannot be stopped. Cows represent nourishment and the partnership between mankind and nature. Then we have pigs, fertility. They were especially sacred to the Vannic deities. Pigs are intelligent, they're very good fighters, and resourceful foragers. I've heard some people who said that they don't really want to keep pigs, not necessarily because of the stink they make, but because they would have to outwit the animal, and that's a lot of mental effort some days, or so I'm told. Then we have goats. We know that the god Thor himself kept goats. They pulled his chariot. They provided meat for his table. And with his hammer, he was actually able to both use them to pull his chariot and eat them in the evening and then resurrect them in the morning and just continue on that process into perpetuity. Goats represent fertility, stability, and courage. And then the last animal the authors mentioned was horses, and they considered this to be the most powerful animal symbol within the faith. The bond between humans and horses is profound. It has spanned the ages and so many different cultures. Horses have a lot of personality, and I think that personality enables us to bond with them on a level that's a bit beyond what we can do with other animals. They represent nobility, independence, power, wealth, travel, and war. That brings us to part three, which is the runes. Some people do dismiss runes as just being, the earliest known form of a Teutonic alphabet. Whoop-de-doo, everybody. But that opinion doesn't take into account how the runes came into being, how they were used and viewed by both the gods and our ancestors, and the meanings associated with them. The authors acknowledge that the debate around runes, both within and without the community, is rather spicy and acrimonious. Pretty much the only universal point of agreement amongst heathens is that the runes are significant. Everything else from that point, it could be an argument. The approach that the authors take is based on, and this is their words, a study of the runes in our lore, historical records, and the works of establishment scholars, augmented and influenced by a deep understanding of our cultural history and the ways of our people. So that's how it's introduced. Part four was the origins of the runes. It was extremely lengthy, and I have no intention of getting too lost in the weeds on this. So, to make an excessively long story short, the mythological origin of the runes comes from the story of Odin hanging on the world tree for 9 days. We all know this. But the historical origin of runes has four main theories. Theory 1, the runes originated in Germania amongst the ancestors, and this was of their own invention. Theory 2, Eastern Germanic tribes acquired the knowledge of the runes in consequence of trading with the Greeks. Theory 3, the runes are based on a Latin alphabet, and through contact with Rome, these forms came to Germania. And Theory 4 is that the runes are an adaptation of the Etruscan alphabet by Germanic peoples who lived in the southern Alpines. But however the runes came into being, we have them now, and they mean something to us. Now, there may come a time in my studies when I feel inclined to do a greater deep dive and form my own opinion about which theory do I favor the most. But today is not that day, and my patience for these academic debates where it's focused on their theories and it loses sight of the actual point of what the runes are for, that patience is very limited. Best not to test it too much. Part 5 was the sources on the runes, and I have to say the authors got a bit tetchy in this passage. They categorized things as far as research resources are concerned into two very broad categories. It was either wholly academic, very dry, stuffy reading, or new agey books that is, maybe a few common meanings and a lot of fancifulness layered on top. I find this assertion lacking in nuance. Academic sources are all very well. They serve a useful purpose. But if we look at the runes strictly academically, and that's the only real way we study them, it's unlikely to provide us spiritual insight, let alone instruction of any kind. And I have to say, in defense of modern published books, I don't think that every book on runes that you find in the local library or in a bookstore or on Amazon deserves to be dismissed as nonsensical or being untrue to the cultural and spiritual roots of the runes. Now, there are some books and some authors who do deserve that criticism, and fair enough, but others don't. And just because the authors haven't encountered these books or these authors, or perhaps they haven't investigated them very thoroughly, perhaps due to a bit of misplaced snobbery that I think I was detecting. That just doesn't mean that those books don't exist. Books that are actually good, written from a more spiritual perspective about the runes and have genuine relevancy for modern practitioners. Another point that I quibble about with the authors is their complete disdain for any modern associations with the runes, such as, perhaps crystals, tarot cards, elements, things of that nature. If an author says that those associations are ancient, then that would be a misrepresentation unless, they can show their work in the lore or in cultural research that says, yeah, I think this was actually a thing. But if an author acknowledges that these associations are a modern development and they provide a line of reasoning for why they think these things have compatible energies or their energies in the same vein or how they might help each other, then I think that's at least worth considering. And it doesn't mean that the author just made it up. In all probability, the author has experimented with these things and they noted a correlation of the energies through trial and error, and they reached their own conclusions, which they are there then sharing in a book. So I have zero sympathy for the mindset that rejects the notion of any adaptation and that there must not be evolution in spiritual matters. If it's not strict, pure reconstructionism, then it just doesn't count. Oh, that provokes me. Because paganism and heathenry are natural religions. They evolve by definition through time. And just because we have a certain period of time where we have a little bit of insight about what our ancestors were doing, that does not mean what our ancestors were doing then matches up with what our ancestors were doing, say, 3,000 years ago. I bet you anything, if we had the information available to us, we would discover that things changed. We have to keep in mind that heathenry, paganism, these are not revealed religions. You don't, you have your scriptures and these are your procedures for how you conduct worship, and that's that, and anything outside of it is wrong and heresy. Earlier in the book, the authors acknowledge that the gods have continuously evolved and grown through the ages. And let's be realistic. We are not aware of the full impact of what that means. And we certainly don't know of all the ways they have available to them that they might choose to communicate with us or, to give us the little nudges that they do. So it could very well be that someone's saying, I think I associate that rune with that crystal a little bit. Maybe that is an actual legitimate divine nudge. But if we just reject all modern developments out of hand, I think that's short-sighted to say the least. I'm not saying that we have to believe any and everything that we're told, but if someone can at least present a reasonable argument for their viewpoint, then it's to our benefit to at least consider that and put it to the test and decide for ourselves if anything's there. That's all I'm saying. Next, we had part 6, which focused on the Elder Futhark. The authors explained that the most commonly agreed meanings and associations with each runes are what they focused on in this text. I'm not going to go through them one by one in this video. Starting next February, I'm going to be doing a video series on the runes, and I will be going through them one by one. And I will be including this book as one of the sources that I use to inform that particular series. Also, I think if I was just to list the runes and then their meanings, I don't think that would be particularly useful in and of itself. So we'll hold out and we will wait for better things. Now, part 7, deeper meanings of the runes. This is the portion of the text where I find myself coming back into alignment with the authors. They acknowledge that the word rune can mean secret or whisper, and that it's worth a while to treat that as a clue to follow up on in our own studies and practices. They go on to say that some of the meanings and insights we glean from the runes may be very personal as opposed to a universal meaning. So they suggest meditation, as well as further studies into heathen cultures to help shape our understanding. And of course, examining the relationship between the runes in and of themselves, particularly if we put them out on a spread, that can also be very fruitful, gives a little bit of context. Part 8 was about ancestral usage, which of course is a controversial subject. There is a very determined camp that denies any insinuation that the runes were ever anything more than secular. And then there's another camp that throws a hissy fit if runes are used for mundane purposes, because they consider that desecration. Like the authors, I consider both of these extremes as inaccurate, silly, and counterproductive. The simplest explanation is also the most obvious, I think, that the runes are multi-layered and multifunctional. They can be and were once used as a common script, as well as being used in magic, divination, and other spiritual purposes. More than one thing can be true at the same time. This isn't contradictory, it just requires us to take context into account. Then part 9 was about rune magic, because despite the protestation of some detractors, the authors have concluded that it is undeniable that our ancestors did use the runes for magical purposes. The only question is that how is this going to be handled, and what relevancy is this for modern heathens? Their first suggestion is to focus on a specific rune during meditation. I know that some people choose to sing or to chant a rune while they are meditating, and some people have had very good experiences with that. There are also stories of people carving battle runes when going to war. While many of us are not headed for the battlefield, at least I hope not, but the world's in an unstable state, so we'll see. If we use runes, carving them or singing them to help build up our confidence and our power before we tackle something difficult, that could be pretty helpful. And of course, runes can be used in divination. In my experience, not only are runes an effective tool for this, but they tend to be a lot more forthright than tarot cards. Don't expect them to spare your feelings, but you will glean useful counsel. You just have to maybe set aside, but that hurt me for 5 minutes. And if you can do that, then you will get some benefit out of the runes. So that does it for section 7. Next week, we'll take a look into section 8, which discusses heathen ritual, which is bound to be pretty interesting. After focusing so much on the esoteric this week with symbols and runes, it'll be nice to explore something a bit more practical. The beautiful thing about all forms of paganism is that our studies aren't just about, collecting and then regurgitating information. That we aren't doing a test to see who has the best memory and can recite the most amount of information. Much like secular scholars who can expound very knowledgeably and intelligently about the lore, it's not the same thing as actually understanding the meaning of it all on a bone deep level and allowing that to shape its your character and your conduct. I think we show our faith in the doing, the living and the breathing of it. No one, we don't have to, show one face to the world and show another face to the gods. We can have genuine integrity. It's a path of integration of every level of our being, which I think is one of the strongest aspects of pagan spirituality. So next week, we get our hands dirty a little bit, I hope. But that will do it for this particular video. Any reactions, your own thoughts to any of this information, especially if you see that there is some deviation between what the authors think and what I think, at least at this stage, share those opinions with me down in the comment section, or come on to Gilded. There's a link to join us in the description box. You can share all your opinions there, and I hope to see you soon. But that will do it for now, and I will see you next time. Bye.